Okay, good evening, everybody. Hopefully, you can all see and hear me. I have my chat up, so if there is a problem, please let me know and I will try and fix it. One of the things I'd like to mention, you'll notice looks a bit different here. I've been having trouble as the light, in the evening it gets darker and darker the farther into winter we go. I've been having a lot of trouble down here in my office, getting the lighting right. Last time I think I ended up looking like a talking orange. So this time I decided to turn on the overhead lights. I don't really like using them. I think it makes things look very, clinical, unwelcoming. But that's where we are right now. I did not show up with enough time to experiment with the lighting, so this is how we're going to do it today. Just very briefly before we get started, there are a couple of notes. The very first thing I'd like to do before I, dig into everything is, it will have escaped none of you that here in the United States we have had an election yesterday. Now, I am not going to comment on the election or the results that have come in or the results that have yet to come in. But there was a prayer which comes from the Book of Common Prayer that was posted earlier today by the Episcopal Relief and Development Foundation, on Facebook. And I think it's a very nice prayer, very lovely prayer that really at this moment really speaks to this moment in time. So I'm going to, just before we start, I'm just going to pray that prayer very quickly. This comes from the Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church here in the United States, page 823. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions may disappear, and hatreds may cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the election tonight. So hopefully you were not tuning in for an election broadcast, because I'm not going to do it. So we are continuing tonight with the reading of Mere Christianity, which was written by C.S. Lewis. Let's see, here it is. Oh, pop up on the screen there. I will start with my standard, little preface while we've been reading this, is that C.S. Lewis is a deep thinker, popular author, and everyone's favorite amateur theologian. But C.S. Lewis is ultimately a product of his time. And what I mean by that is that he does occasionally make comments that we would find objectionable today, particularly in regards to homosexuality and also kind of women's place in the world or in a family or in a marriage or something like that. And so there is this view going around these days that if anyone has ever expressed an objectionable view, that means that everything they've done is automatically suspect and should be canceled, or something like that. I do not hold this view. I think that is an incorrect and narrow view. I believe that we shouldn't gloss over, and I will not gloss over, the incorrect things, the objectionable things that C.S. Lewis says. If we come to them, I will read them as he wrote them, and we will discuss them at the end. I think we've gotten past the point in the book where those comments are, but it's been a while since I've read the book in full by myself, so I can't guarantee that. So just in case, that's my little kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a trigger warning or whatever, but just in case, that's what's going on here. We will be diving right into that in just a moment. First of all, you'll remember I like to start each episode with by reading a different poem. Today's poem was written by the poet Maya Angelou, and it is called Still I Rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear. I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. So that was Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. A very powerful poem speaking to, the injustices that she undoubtedly faced, both as an African American and as a woman. So hopefully you enjoyed that. So tonight we are continuing in Book 4. This will be our penultimate episode, and if you are not clear on what penultimate means, it means second to last. Very fancy way of saying it, but that's what it means. So tonight we are still in the final of the four books that make up the overall book. The book itself is called Beyond Personality, or First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. And the first chapter we'll be reading, chapter 6, is called Two Notes. In order to avoid misunderstanding, I here add notes on 2 points arising out of the last chapter. One sensible critic wrote asking me why, if God wanted sons instead of toy soldiers, he did not beget many sons at the outset, instead of first making toy soldiers and then bringing them to life by such a difficult and painful process. One part of the answer to this question is fairly easy. The other part is probably beyond all human knowledge. The easy part is this. The process of being turned from a creature into a son would not have been difficult or painful if the human race had not turned away from God centuries ago. They were able to do this because he gave them free will. He gave them free will because a world of mere automata could never love and therefore never know infinite happiness. The difficult part is this. All Christians are agreed that there is, in the full and original sense, only one Son of God. If we insist on asking, but could there have been many, we find ourselves in very deep water. Have the words could have been any sense at all when applied to God? You can say that one particular finite thing could have been different from what it is because it would have been different if something else had been different, and the something else would have been different if some third thing had been different, and so on and so forth. The letters on this page would have been red if the printer had used red ink, and he would have used red ink if he had been instructed to, and so on. But when you are talking about God, i.e., about the rock bottom, irreducible fact, that's with a capital F, on which all other facts depend, it is nonsensical to ask if it could have been otherwise. It is what it is, and there is an end to the matter. But quite apart from this, I find a difficulty about the very idea of the Father begetting many sons from all eternity. In order to be many, they would have to somehow be different from one another. 2 pennies have the same shape. How are they two? By occupying different places and containing different atoms. In other words, to think of them as different, we have had to bring in space and matter. In fact, we had to bring in nature, or the created universe. I can understand the distinction between the Father and the Son without bringing in space or matter, because the one begets and the other is begotten. The Father's relation to the Son is not the same as their Son's relation to the Father. But if there were several sons, they would all be related to one another and to the Father in the same way. How would they differ from one another? One does not notice the difficulty at first, of course. One thinks one can form the idea of several sons. But when I think closely, I find that the idea seemed possible only because I was vaguely imagining them as human forms standing about together in some kind of space. In other words, though I pretended to be thinking about something that exists before any universe was made, I was really smuggling in the picture of a universe and putting that something inside it. When I stop doing that and still try to think of the Father begetting many sons before all worlds, I find I am not really thinking of anything. The idea fades away into mere words. Was nature, space, and time and matter created precisely in order to make manyness possible? Is there perhaps no other way of getting many eternal spirits except by first making many natural creatures in a universe and then spiritualizing them? But of course all this is guesswork. The idea that the whole human race is, in a sense, one thing, one huge organism like a tree, must not be confused with the idea that individual differences do not matter, or that real people, Tom and Nobby and Kate, are somehow less important than collective things like classes, races, and so forth. Indeed, the two ideas are opposites. Things which are parts of a single organism may be very different from one another. Things which are not may be very alike. 6 pennies are quite separate and very alike. But my nose and my lungs are very different, but they are only alive at all because they are parts of my body and share its common life. Christianity thinks of human individuals not as mere members of a group or items in a list, but as organs in a body, different from one another and each contributing what no other could. When you find yourself wanting to turn your children or pupils or even your neighbors into people exactly like yourself, remember that God probably never meant them to be that. You and they are different organs intended to do different things. On the other hand, when you are tempted not to bother about someone else's troubles because they are no business of yours, remember that though he is different from you, he is part of the same organism as you. If you forget that he belongs to the same organism as yourself, you will become an individualist. If you forget that he is a different organ from you, if you want to suppress differences and make people all alike, you will become a totalitarian. But a Christian must not be either a totalitarian or an individualist. I feel a strong desire to tell you, and I expect you feel a strong desire to tell me, which of these two errors is the worst. That is the devil getting at us. He always sends errors into the world in pairs of opposites. And he always encourages us to spend a lot of time thinking which is the worse. You see why, of course. He relies on your extra dislike of the one error to draw you gradually into the opposite one. But do not let us be fooled. We have to keep our eyes on the goal and go straight through between both errors. We have no other concern than that with either of them. Chapter 7, Let's Pretend. Before I do that, I'm just going to take a brief drink of water here real quick. May I once again start by putting two pictures, or two stories rather, into your minds. One is the story you have all read, called Beauty and the Beast. The girl, you remember, had to marry a monster for some reason, and she did. She kissed it as if it were a man, and then, much to her relief, it really turned into a man, and all went well. The other story is about someone who had to wear a mask which made him look much nicer than he really was. He had to wear it for years, and when he took it off, he found his own face had grown to fit it. He was now really beautiful. Sorry. What had begun as a disguise had become a reality. I think both of these stories may, in a fanciful way of course, help to illustrate what I have to say in this chapter. Up till now I've been trying to describe facts, what God is and what He has done. Now I want to talk about practice. What do we do next? What difference does all this theology make? It can start making a difference tonight. If you are interested enough to have read thus far, you are probably interested enough to make a shot at saying your prayers, and whatever else you say, you will probably say the Lord's Prayer. Its very first words are Our Father. Do you now see what those words mean? They mean, quite frankly, that you are putting yourself in the place of a son of God. To put it bluntly, you are dressing up as Christ. If you like, you are pretending. Because, of course, the moment you realize that what the words mean, you realize that you are not a son of God. You are not a being like the Son of God, whose will and interests are at one with those of the Father. You are a bundle of self-centered fears, hopes, greeds, jealousies, and self-conceit, all doomed to death. So that, in a way, this dressing up as Christ is a piece of outrageous cheek. But the odd thing is that He has ordered us to do it. Why? What is the good of pretending to be what you are not? Well, even on the human level, you know there are two kinds of pretending. There is a bad kind where the pretense is there instead of the real thing, as when a man pretends he is going to help you instead of really helping you. But there is also a good kind where the pretense leads up to the real thing. When you are not feeling particularly friendly, but you know you ought to be, the best thing you can do very often is to put on a friendly manner and behave as if you were a nicer person than you actually are. And in a few minutes, as we have all noticed, you will be really feeling friendlier than you were. Very often the only way to get a quality in reality is to start behaving as if you had it already. That is why children's games are so important. They are always pretending to be grown-ups, playing soldiers, playing shop, but all the time they are hardening their muscles and sharpening their wits so that the pretense of being grown-up helps them to grow up in earnest. Now, the moment you realize, here I am dressing up as Christ, it is extremely likely that you will see at once some way in which at that very moment the pretense could be made less of a pretense and more of a reality. You will find several things going on in your mind which would not be going on there if you were really a son of God. Well, stop them. Or you may realize that instead of saying your prayers, you ought to be downstairs writing a letter or helping your wife to wash up. Well, go and do it. You see what is happening? The Christ Himself, the Son of God who is man just like you and God just like His Father, is actually at your side and is already at that moment beginning to turn your pretense into reality. This is not merely a fancy way of saying that your conscience is telling you what to do. If you simply ask your conscience, you get one result. If you remember that you are dressing up as Christ, you get a different one. There are lots of things which your conscience might not call definitely wrong, especially things in your mind, but which you will see at once you cannot go on doing if you are seriously trying to be like Christ. For you are no longer thinking simply about right and wrong, you are trying to catch the good infection from a person. It is more like painting a portrait than like obeying a set of rules. And the odd thing is that while in one way it is much harder than keeping rules, in another way it is far easier. The real Son of God is at your side. He is beginning to turn you into the same kind of thing as himself. He is beginning, so to speak, to inject his kind of life and thought, his Zoe, into you, beginning to turn the tin soldier into a live man. The part of you that does not like it is the part that is still tin. Some of you may feel that this is very unlike your own experience. You may say, I have never had the sense of being helped by an invisible Christ, but I have often been helped by other human beings. That is rather like the woman in the First War who said that if there were a bread shortage, it would not bother her house because they always ate toast. If there is no bread, there will be no toast. If there were no help from Christ, there would be no help from other human beings. He works on us in all sorts of ways, not only through what we think of as our religious life. He works through nature, through our own bodies, through books, sometimes through experiences which seem at the time anti-Christian. When a young man who has been going to church in a routine way honestly realizes that he does not believe in Christianity and stops going, provided he does it for honesty's sake and not just to annoy his parents, the Spirit of Christ is probably nearer to him then than it ever was before. But above all, he works on us through each other. Men are mirrors or carriers of Christ to other men, sometimes unconscious carriers. This good infection, if you will, can be carried by those who have not got it themselves. People who were not Christians themselves helped me to Christianity, but usually it is those who know him that bring him to others. That is why the church, the whole body of Christians, showing him to one another is so important. You might say that when two Christians are following Christ together, there is not twice as much Christianity as when they are apart, but 16 times as much. But do not forget this. At first, it is natural for a baby to take its mother's milk without knowing its mother. It is equally natural for us to see the man who helps us without seeing Christ behind him. But we must not remain babies. We must go on to recognize the real giver. It is madness not to, because if we do not, we shall be relying on human beings, and that is going to let us down. The best of them will make mistakes. All of them will die. We must be thankful to the people who have helped us. We must honor them and love them, but never, never pin your whole faith on any human being. Not if he is the best and the wisest in the whole world. There are lots of nice things you can do with sand, but do not try building a house on it. And now we begin to see what it is that the New Testament is always talking about. It talks about Christians being born again. It talks about them putting on Christ, about Christ being formed in us, about our coming to have the mind of Christ. Put right out of your head the idea that these are only fancy ways of saying that Christians are to read what Christ said and try to carry it out, as a man may read Plato or Marx and try to carry that out. They mean something much more than that. They mean that a real person, Christ, here and now, in that very room where you are saying your prayers, is doing things to you. It is not a question of a good man who died 2,000 years. It is a living man, still as much a man as you and still as much God as he was when he created the world, really coming and interfering with your very self, killing the old natural self in you and replacing it with the kind of self he has. At first only for moments. then for longer periods. Finally, if all goes well, turning you permanently into a different sort of thing, into a new little Christ, a being which in its own small way has the same kind of life as God, which shares in his power, joy, knowledge, and eternity, and soon we make two other discoveries. We begin to notice, besides our particular sinful acts, our sinfulness. Begin to be alarmed not only about what we do, but about what we are. This may sound rather difficult, so I will try to make it clear from my own case. When I come to my evening prayers and I try to reckon up the sins of the day, 9 times out of 10 the most obvious one is some sin against charity. I have sulked, or snapped, or sneered, or snubbed, or stormed, and the excuse that immediately springs to my mind is that the provocation was so sudden and unexpected. I was caught off my guard. I had not time to collect myself. Now that may be extenuating circumstances as regards those particular acts. They would obviously be worse if they had been deliberate and premeditated. On the other hand, surely what a man does when he is taken off his guard is the best evidence for what sort of man he is. Surely what pops out before the man has time to put on a disguise is the truth. If there are rats in a cellar, you are most likely to see them if you go in very suddenly, but the suddenness does not create the rats, it only prevents them from hiding. In the same way, the suddenness of the provocation does not make me an ill-tempered man, it only shows me what an ill-tempered man I am. The rats are always there in the cellar, but if you go in shouting and noisily, they will have taken cover before you switch on the light. Apparently the rats of resentment and vindictiveness are always there in the cellar of my soul. Now that cellar is out of the reach of my conscious will, I can to some extent control my acts. I have no direct control over my temperament. And if, as I said before, what we are matters even more than what we do, if indeed what we do matters chiefly as evidence of what we are, then it follows that the change which I most need to undergo is a change that my own direct, voluntary efforts cannot bring about. And this applies to my good actions too. How many of them were done for the right motive? How many for fear of public opinion or desire to show off? How many from a sort of obstinacy or a sense of superiority which in different circumstances might equally have led to some very bad act? But I cannot by direct moral effort give myself new motives. After the first few steps in the Christian life, we realize that everything which really needs to be done in our souls can be done only by God. And that brings us to something which has been very misleading in my language up to now. I have been talking as if it were we who did everything. In reality, of course, it is God who does everything. We at most allow it to be done to us. In a sense, you might even say it is God who does the pretending. The three-personal God, so to speak, sees before him, in fact, a self-centered, greedy, grumbling, rebellious, human animal. But he says, let us pretend that this is not a mere creature, but our Son. It is like Christ in so far as it is a man, for he became man. Let us pretend that it is also like him in spirit. Let us treat it as if it were what in fact it is not. Let us pretend in order to make the pretense into a reality. God looks at you as if you were a little Christ. Christ stands beside you to turn you into one. I dare say this idea of a divine make-believe sounds rather strange at first, but is it so strange, really? Is not that how the higher thing always raises the lower? A mother teaches her baby to talk by talking to it as if it understood long before it really does. We treat our dogs as if they were almost human. That is why they really become almost human in the end. Chapter 8. Is Christianity hard or easy? I'm going to take another swig of water here. In the previous chapter, we were considering the Christian idea of putting on Christ, or first dressing up as a son of God, in order that you may finally become a real son. What I want to make clear is that this is not one among many jobs a Christian has to do, and it is not a sort of special exercise for the top class. It is the whole of Christianity. Christianity offers nothing else at all, and I should like to point out how it differs from ordinary ideas of morality and being good. The ordinary idea which we all have before we become Christians is this. We take as a starting point our ordinary self with its various desires and interests. We then admit that something else, call it morality or decent behavior or the good of society, has claims on this self, claims which interfere with its own desires. What we mean by being good is giving in to those claims. Some of the things the ordinary self wanted to do turn out to be what we call wrong. Well, we must give them up. Other things which the self did not want to do turn out to be what we call right. Well, we shall have to do them. But we are hoping all the time that when all the demands have been met, the poor natural self will still have some chance and some time to get on with its own life and do what it likes. In fact, we are very like an honest man paying his taxes. He pays them all right, but he does hope that there will be enough left over for him to live on, because we are still taking our natural self as the starting point. As long as we are thinking that way, one or other of two results is likely to follow. Either we give up trying to be good, or else we become very unhappy indeed. For make no mistake, if you are really going to try to meet all the demands made on the natural self, it will not have enough left over for you to live on. The more you obey your conscience, the more your conscience will demand of you, and your natural self, which is thus being starved and hampered and worried at every turn, will get angrier and angrier. In the end, you will either give up trying to be good, or else become one of those people who, as they say, live for others, but always in a discontented, grumbling way, always wondering why the others do not notice it more, and always making a martyr of yourself. And once you've become that, you will be a far greater pest to anyone who has to live with you than you would have been if you had remained frankly selfish. The Christian way is different, harder and easier. Christ says, "Give me all." I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work. I want you. I have not come to torment your natural self, but to kill it. No half measures are any good. I don't want to cut off a branch here and a branch there. I want to have the whole tree down. I don't want to drill the tooth or crown it or stop it, but to have it out. Hand over the whole natural self, all the desires which you think innocent, as well as the ones you think wicked, the whole outfit. I will give you a new self instead. In fact, I will give you myself. My own will shall become yours, both harder and easier than what we are all trying to do. You have noticed, I expect, that Christ himself sometimes describes the Christian way as very hard, sometimes as very easy. He says, "Take up your cross." In other words, it is like going to be beaten to death in a concentration camp. Next minute he says, "My yoke is easy and my burden light." He means both, and one can just see why both are true. Teachers will tell you that the laziest boy in the class is the one who works hardest in the end. They mean this. If you give two boys, say, a proposition in geometry to do, the one who is prepared to take trouble will try to understand it. The lazy boys will try to learn it by heart, because for the moment that needs less effort. But 6 months later, when they are preparing for an exam, that lazy boy is doing hours and hours of miserable drudgery over things that the other boy understands and positively enjoys in a few minutes. Laziness means more work in the long run. Or look at it this way. In a battle or in mountain climbing, there is often one thing which it takes a lot of pluck to do, but it is also in the long run the safest thing to do. If you funk it, you will find yourself hours later in far worse danger. The cowardly thing is also the most dangerous thing. It is like that here. The terrible thing, the almost impossible thing, is to hand over your whole self, all your wishes and precautions to Christ. But it is far easier than what we are all trying to do instead. For what we are trying to do is to remain what we call ourselves, to keep personal happiness as our great aim in life, and yet at the same time to be good. We're all trying to let our mind and heart go their own way, centered on money or pleasure or ambition, and hoping, in spite of this, to behave honestly and chastely and humbly. And that is exactly what Christ warned us you could not do. As he said, a thistle cannot produce figs. If I am a field that contains nothing but grass seed, I cannot produce wheat. Cutting the grass may keep it short, but I shall still produce grass and no wheat. If I want to produce wheat, the change must go deeper than the surface. I must be plowed up and resown. That is why the real problem of the Christian life comes where people do not usually look for it. It comes the very moment you wake up each morning. All your wishes and hopes for the day rush at you like wild animals, and the first job each morning consists simply in shoving them all back, in listening to that other voice, taking that other point of view, letting that other larger, stronger, quieter life come flowing in, and so on all day. Standing back from all your natural fussings and frettings, coming in out of the wind. We can only do it for moments at first. But from those moments, the new sort of life will be spreading through our system, because now we are letting him work at the right part of us. It is the difference between paint, which is merely laid on the surface, and a dye or stain which soaks right through. He never talked vague, idealistic gas. When he said, "Be perfect," he meant it. He meant that we must go in for the full treatment. It is hard, but the sort of compromise we are all hankering after is harder. In fact, it is impossible. It may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird. It would be a jolly sight harder for it to learn to fly while remaining an egg. We're like eggs at present, and you cannot go on indefinitely being just an ordinary decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad. May I come back to what I said before? This is the whole of Christianity. There is nothing else. It is so easy to get muddled about that. It is easy to think that the church has a lot of different objects: education, building, missions, holding services, just as it is easy to think the state has a lot of different objects: military, political, economic, and whatnot. But in a way, things are much simpler than that. The state exists simply to promote and to protect the ordinary happiness of human beings in this life. A husband and wife chatting over a fire, a couple of friends having a game of darts in a pub, a man reading a book in his own room or digging in his own garden. That is what the state is there for. And unless they are helping to increase and prolong and protect such moments, all the laws, parliaments, armies, courts, police, economics, etc., are simply a waste of time. In the same way, the church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself, are simply a waste of time. God became man for no other purpose. It is even doubtful, whether the whole universe was created for any other purpose. It says in the Bible that the whole universe was made for Christ, and that everything is to be gathered together in him. I do not suppose any of us can understand how this will happen as regards the whole universe. We do not know what, if anything, lives in the parts of it that are millions of miles away from this earth. Even on this earth, we do not know how it applies to things other than men. After all, that is what you would expect. We have been shown the plan only insofar as it concerns ourselves. I sometimes like to imagine that I can see how it might apply to other things. I think I can see how the higher animals are in a sense drawn into man when he loves them and makes them, as he does, much more nearly human than they would otherwise be. I can even see a sense in which the dead things and plants are drawn into man as he studies them and uses and appreciates them, and if there were intelligent creatures in other worlds, they might do the same with their worlds. It might be that when intelligent creatures entered into Christ, they would, in that way, bring all other things in along with them. But I do not know. It is only a guess. What we have been told is how we men can be drawn into Christ, can become part of that wonderful present which the young Prince of the universe wants to offer to his Father, that present which is himself, and therefore us in him. It is the only thing we were made for, and there are strange, exciting hints in the Bible that when we are drawn in a great many other things in nature will begin to come right. The bad dream will be over. It will be morning. So that is the end of the last chapter we are reading tonight. So if you have any comments, if you're watching out there and have any comments, feel free to type them in. I can see the chat from both Twitch and YouTube, so feel free to type in any thoughts. There was a lot of kind of really metaphysical stuff in what we heard here tonight. So I'm kind of going to skip that first chapter. It was a little confusing. But I'm going to focus, I think, my comments on the middle chapter about Let's Pretend. And I think that this is a very interesting thing. I think it's, in some ways, not always, but in some ways, this is a very Anglican idea that he puts here. This idea of putting on the mask or pretending to be Christ and thus becoming a little Christ. And that's because, as Anglicans, Anglicans all use in some form or another a common prayer book. So this is, let me put it over here. This is a copy of the 1979 Book of Common Prayer for the Episcopal Church of the United States. I actually have, I think right here, this you'll see here. This is the prayer book, the Common Prayer Book, used by the Anglican Church in New Zealand. And the point of all these prayer books, the point of us all praying the same thing, goes back to the part of the original idea of the prayer book, written by Thomas Cranmer all the way back in the 16th century. And all of our modern ones are to some extent based on the one he wrote in the 16th century. And that is, he had a belief, and this is pretty much the basic underlying belief or tenet of Anglicanism, if you will. And the fancy Latin word is I think it's lex orandi, lex credendi, or something like that, or that might be the other way around. And it basically means that praying shapes belief. Lex orandi, lex credendi, yes. So directly translated, it means the law of what is to be prayed is the law of what is to be believed. And that is this idea that prayer shapes belief. So by having composed prayers and pre-written prayers, if you pray it repeatedly over and over again, you come to believe it. And that's basically the idea that C.S. Lewis is expressing in this chapter. This is this is essentially to put it in very, very crude terms, what C.S. Lewis is saying is fake it till you make it. Now that's not exactly what he means, but it's a basic idea that by imitating Christ, whether we mean to, whether we feel it deeply or not, that by imitating Christ, we become like Christ. And again, the lex orandi, lex credendi thing is essentially the fundamental bit of all Anglicanism. It is why we have common prayer books. So the idea is that we all, the important things we all begin to believe together because we pray it. So one thing is, and I personally, from personal experience, firmly believe that your praying can shape your belief if you kind of, in some ways, fake it till you make it. So it may, and I think I've said this before, I don't know if I've said it while we've been reading this book, but I know one of the previous books we've read on this channel, I've kind of told this story. I used to be a very angry person. Now what I mean by that is that I'm not saying that I went around storming around or throwing temper tantrums or stuff like that. You could have met me and maybe even known me for years at the time and not, for the most part, realized that I had just this huge amount of anger at things inside of me. Now, this is not to say that, I believe I've changed. That's not to say I don't get angry. That's a different thing. But I don't live in that place of anger anymore. And one of the things when you have anger like that is you hate people. And I'm defining hate as wishing people dead or wishing ill upon them. Now the truth is this. The people I hated were no one I knew personally. They were, say, certain politicians and terrorists and things like that. People that you would not blame me for hating. You would think, well, it's perfectly reasonable to hate those sorts of people. But hatred is not Christian. Hatred is an emotion, a status, a kind of that is in direct opposition to God. And so I began, as I would feel these things, I began to add to my evening prayers each night a prayer that you'll find in the Book of Common Prayer. And that is a prayer for our enemies. And it says, O God, the Father of all, whose Son commanded us to love our enemies, lead them and us from prejudice to truth. Deliver them and us from hatred, cruelty, and revenge, and in your good time enable us all to stand reconciled before you through Jesus Christ our Lord. And I prayed that every night when I did my evening prayers. Now, I don't pray it as much anymore, but because I don't feel I need to anymore. I kind of faked it till I made it, in the sense that I am a much less angry person. Again, I get angry at things, that's not what I'm saying, but I don't live permanently 24 hours a day with that huge anger inside of me. There is not a single person on this earth, no one, that I hate, no one that I wish were dead or that I wish sickness or ill fortune upon. Now, that does not mean that there aren't people who I wish would not do the things they do, or were in some way made unable to do the things that they do. But I don't wish them dead. I don't hate them. Now, I have not quite been able to bring myself necessarily to that status of Christ where I love them, but at least I've taken a step. And to me, that's kind of what that chapter was speaking about. The idea of imitating Christ, and that in imitating him, you become more like him. And, C.S. Lewis used some perfect examples. We have all had those situations where, for whatever reason, you're just really not feeling that friendly that day. You don't necessarily dislike the person coming in the door or something like that. You just don't really feel like being friendly that day. But you know that you should be. And that it's not that person's fault that you're feeling that way. And so you act friendly. And oddly enough, you may find that after a few minutes of friendly conversation, you're feeling a lot better about them, about yourself, and about your day. So we've all had experiences like that. So I think that's where I'm going to wrap up my comments, because a lot of the other stuff is really kind of really high-end metaphysical stuff that's kind of we all end up with our own interpretation of, and whether we agree with C.S. Lewis or not. Again, I'm not saying when I read this book that I agree 100% with all of the conclusions that C.S. Lewis comes to with all of his thoughts, but I think that this is an excellent book for two reasons. First, I think it really helps people who are not Christians to in some way understand Christianity. For the first part of the book, understand Christianity in the sense of the logic, because there is this idea among some people that it is not that a person who is religious is not logical. That if they believed in logic and science, that they would not be religious. Well, I consider myself a fairly logical person. And I believe in science. I'm not saying that there are not Christian churches out there who, believe and teach a very strict interpretation of the creation story and the 7 days and all that. I am not among them. I believe science has shown us that evolution occurred. I believe science has shown us that the universe as it exists today has essentially come to the form it is today slowly over a roughly 13 to 14 billion year period, which is a time that is so vast that it is impossible for the human mind to grasp. But I believe that there is a logical progression to belief in God, and to some extent to a belief in Christ. And that's what C.S. Lewis talks about for the first part of his thing. So if you are not a Christian, you want to understand how someone can be rational or logical or something like that and still believe in religion, still believe in Christianity, the first half of this book really helps you out there. And it also, the whole book gives a lot of thought for people who are Christians to think more deeply about their faith and about the reasons that they believe what they believe. Sometimes you do just believe it for no particular reason. You haven't really thought about it carefully and considered it. But C.S. Lewis helps, in my opinion, to think deeply about all of these issues. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm not seeing any comments, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up tonight's episode. Our next episode will be on Saturday. I believe it's the 7th, is it? 7th, yes. Saturday the 7th at 6 p.m. It will be the final episode that we are dealing with Mere Christianity. I have not 100% decided yet on what we are reading next. I am likely to take at least a 2-episode, that's a 1-week break between this and the next book. I will figure that out Obviously, you feel free to write in the comments or send me a message or anything on YouTube or Facebook or Twitch or something like that if you have suggestions, and I will consider them. So again, our final episode of Mere Christianity will be on Saturday, the 7th of November at 6 p.m., where we will be reading chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Book 4, and that will be the end of this book. And you will have come a long way reading a, major kind of classic book about Christian thought and theology. So that's it. So I'd like to thank you for joining me this evening. And if you're watching this on a delay, thank you for watching. And have a great evening.